Mark Twain once said, "It's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that really trouble me. It's all the things in the Bible that I do understand. That's what really troubles me." There are a significant number of people who, when they read it, are just troubled by what they find. And the Bible, which was meant to draw people to God, actually becomes a barrier for many people. It's not a lack of faith that leads us to wrestle with the Bible. It's because we have faith that when we find something that seems inconsistent with the character of God, that we wrestle with that. I hope when people are done reading this book that they have an appreciation for the historical context, the culture of Scripture, how the Bible was put together, who wrote it, why they wrote it, and then how to make sense of its troubling passages so that they can read the Bible and they can hear God speaking through it.
So we're continuing this Making Sense of the Bible series that we've been in. It's based on a book by Adam Hamilton. Rabbi Shmuly's talk today won't be based on the book. It's coming from his own experience and his own knowledge. But as we struggle with these questions about what the Bible is and how to interpret it, we thought, who better to bring in to talk about some of the questions we have than Rabbi Shmuly, somebody who has dedicated his life to working for social justice, compassion. He's done so much good. He's such an inspiring leader. And we wanted to invite him to come in and address some of the questions that we have, but also to share from his heart about what motivates him, what inspires him to do the good that he does, and what gives him joy. So I want to give him a formal introduction. Rabbi Dr. Shmuly Yanklowitz studied at the University of Texas as an undergraduate, Harvard University for a master's degree in leadership and psychology, Yeshiva University for a second master's degree in Jewish philosophy, and at Columbia University for his doctorate in moral development and epistemology. He is taught as an instructor of moral philosophy at Bernard College and at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. Shmuly was ordained as a rabbi by Yeshivat Chofavei Torah as a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Rabbi Shmuly has served as a congregational rabbi and as a campus senior Jewish educator and Hillel director of Jewish Life. As a global social justice activist and educator, Shmuly has volunteered, taught, and staffed missions in 5 continents, including Israel, Ghana, India, France, Thailand, El Salvador, Britain, Senegal, Germany, Switzerland, Ukraine, Argentina, South Africa, and Haiti. Shmuly serves at the World Economic Forum in Geneva and Davos, Switzerland as the rabbinic representative, a facilitator, and motivational speaker. Rav Shmuly is the founder and president of Uriel Tzedek and founder and CEO of the Shamayim Vaharetz Institute, and is the author of 7 books, and you can purchase those books afterwards if you'd like. A film crew followed Shmuly for over a year to produce a PBS documentary, The Calling, about the training of religious leadership, which aired nationwide in December 2010. In 2012 and 2013, Newsweek rated Rabbi Shmuly one of the top 50 rabbis in the United States. Rabbi Shmuly's collaborated with Jewish world leaders such as Michael Bloomberg, Shimon Peres, and Michael Douglas to address pressing social justice issues. Last May, Rabbi Shmuly was featured in a segment for Religion and Ethics News Weekly on converting to Judaism. Last spring, Rabbi Shmuly donated a kidney to a young man whose life depended on that new kidney, a man he had never met, and inspired other people to do the same. And he advocates for those in need of kidney transplants, urging others to donate as well. Rabbi Shmuly, his wife Shoshana, and his daughter Amela, and his son Lev live in Scottsdale. So join me in welcoming back to One Church our special guest today, Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
When I was invited the first time, I thought it was a mistake. But if I'm back here a second time, I guess it went all right. But in Jewish law, the third time is the time that really determines if it's real or not, right? So we'll see if there's a third invite. It's nice to recognize so many faces again. It's terrific to be with the wonderful, wonderful pastor, Ryan Kier, who is a hero and teacher of mine, and someone who I look to as a model, a clergy person. And I know if I were Christian, I wouldn't miss a service here. You know, maybe as a Jew, I wouldn't miss a service here. It's the truth. I might get in a little trouble. But I love this music, the vibe, the energy you have here. That prayer that was shared was just remarkable. I'd love to get a copy of that. And annual Doubt Day. You know, doubts are, in my belief, doubts are very, very holy. Doubts are not just, okay, I've got to deal with it. I've got this doubt. But actually, there is no, in my belief, there is no faith without doubt. There is no connection without questioning. I think we come closer through questions and through doubts than we do through certainty. We'll come back to this. Maybe I'll share two of my own doubts today. Two of my 1,000. One of those doubts is that there's actually one path to God. Although we've got a lot of people preaching that you follow my path and you're good, right? I have a suspicion, doubt is maybe too soft of a word, for this approach that there is this one path. It certainly feels comfortable to believe that. My second doubt that I'll share this morning is that we're as different as we think we are, right? Now, certainly all of our faiths, and even those who don't embrace faith, have a ton in common. And I also want to validate that those differences are real, and we shouldn't be afraid of those differences. We should encounter them, learn about them. And some cases have boundaries in our own belief of what works and what doesn't. In other cases, be inspired and hold the cognitive dissonance that I don't have all the truth. But I'm pretty sure that we are not as different as we think we are. 99.999% of our genes are identical, and yet we have determined that we are fundamentally different on a biological level, on our spiritual level, in some sense. And so I have a heavy doubt that those who are constantly putting up higher walls of identity to say, I'm different than them, have that right. And I have a heavy doubt in any text that is trying to promote that difference. The believers and the non-believers, right? Those who are of this faith or of that faith. So I want to start with those two doubts. I was at the Parliament of World Religions in Salt Lake City, Utah 2 weeks ago. Is anyone else there? So in Salt Lake City, this is the largest gathering of people of various religions. 10,000 people came from 50 faiths, from 80 countries, right? And we're there. And I'm sitting there experiencing this, and I'm saying to myself, this is remarkable. Right, of faiths I'd never even heard of. They didn't even know they existed. They've got 2,000 of them there. Said, how have I never heard of you? Right, and it's really incredible to see that those differences are so pronounced in how we dress and how we sing and how we praise, and yet when we actually come together on a soulful level, on a spiritual level as just human beings together, right, that we have a remarkable amount in common. When a baby is born, I presume most of us have seen it, a baby is born with his or her fist clenched, right? As if to say, I can take care of myself. I don't really understand anything yet, right? I'm going to kind of stay to myself. But if you've ever witnessed someone die, you know that they pass with their hands open, right? That we pass with our hands open, as if to reach out, that we need. We're born into this world thinking we can take care of ourselves. And we die with the absolute realization that we need one another, right, with our hands open. And if we could only learn this truth earlier, that we're not independent. Somehow we learned as Americans that independence was the highest virtue. I can take care of myself. In fact, there's a virtue to dependence, right, that actually needing one another, needing spouses, needing children, needing parents, needing community, right, needing society to help take care of us and take care of one another. Right, and a baby can't understand this yet. Right, so my daughter now, my 1-year-old still has fist clenched, but my 2.5-year-old, right, everything is I can do it myself. Right, I'll do it all by myself. Right, she believes she can do it all by herself. Right, this at some point, on some level, she realizes, but on some level, we all realize that it's not by ourselves, and we need other faiths. We need one another from other communities to actually achieve what we need to achieve together. And I know this is something we all understand deeply. And when our heart is open to this truth, the question is, what are we willing to sacrifice for that truth? So a story that just happened in Jerusalem a few months ago, a little girl walked into a jewelry store and pointed at what appeared to be the most expensive bracelet in the store. And she said to the gentleman, I would like that one, please. The gentleman in his head thought, this is worth about $4,000 or $5,000. I don't know how this 8-year-old is going to afford this. He says, you have very nice tastes. Who are you buying this for? Little girl says, I'm buying this for my older sister. I said, why? Why such a nice gift for your sister? She says, well, we don't have parents. We're orphans, and my older sister takes care of me. She raises us. And so I want to do something really nice for her and buy something that would mean a lot to her. And she says, I'm prepared to pay for it today. I've worked hard and I've raised some money. She pulls out of her pocket 7 shekel and 80 agurot, which adds up to, in American dollars, just under $2. Hands it over on the counter. The gentleman looks at the bracelet knowing it's a few $1,000s and looks at the little girl and says, that's exactly the price of this bracelet. Accepts the 7 shekel and 80 agurot and hands her the bracelet. The next day, the older sister comes running into the jewelry store. I am so sorry. My sister never should have come here. She must have deceived you or stolen this. I don't know what the case is. Please, here's the bracelet back. He said, no, your sister paid in full. She paid me 7 shekel, 80 agurot, and 1 broken heart. You see, since my wife passed away just a few years ago, my heart hasn't been open until your sister came into this store. People come in all the time and buy jewelry, and they have exactly the amount of money they need to pay for it. But your sister came in with an open and with a broken heart, and so she paid in full. I'm reminded that when we give, when we stretch ourselves, we actually gain much more than we give. This could be told as a story, as a man sacrificing for this little girl. But in fact, he gained tremendously. Because he died, in a sense. We all die, right? In fact, I would suggest we have multiple deaths. Our first death is when we stop loving life. We stop doubting, we stop questioning, we stop opening our hearts to living passionately in this world. Our next death might be when our heart stops or when our brainstem dies. Our next death might be when our body is lowered into the earth, when we're put away from this world. Our next death might be the last time our name is uttered in this world. And perhaps our final death is the last bit of impact that we had fades away. There's layers of death, but that first death perhaps is the most scary, when we stop actually loving life and living life, and we need people to keep us alive, to keep our hearts open, to keep us dependent upon them. And so when we give and we do it with our hearts open, we actually can gain much more. It was mentioned that I was a part of this miraculous experience of a kidney donation. And I would like to pretend like I actually gave this major sacrifice. And in fact, I spent about a few weeks in bed eating ice cream, and my wife took care of our kids. So actually, she made the real sacrifice. I had quite a nice time. I caught up on movies. I had some good food. I had a good excuse to lay there. I never have an excuse to lay there, right? My wife's running around taking care of our babies, doing everything, right? And in fact, this new friend I had, who's now walking around with a new life with a kidney inside, is a new friend. I gained a new inspiration. I have a sense of a higher purpose. I gained much more from that experience than I gave. And in fact, one of the questions at the gates of heaven that I imagine that keeps me up at night is, and I shared this last time I was here, but I try to share it every day with myself or someone I meet. Did you give more or take more from this world? Did you give more or take more? And I've come to the profound conclusion, the terrifying conclusion, that I've taken much more than I've given, right? If you just look at your first 18 years of life, at least the first couple where your diaper's being changed, someone's putting food in your mouth, and then you continue and you sit in a classroom all day throwing spitballs and someone's just teaching you, they're pouring information into your head, right? At some point you start working, but maybe you're paid more than the actual contribution you make through your work. I don't know. Right? To actually give more than you take, is that even possible? Right? We talk about doubts. If I looked at my belief, my faith in God, for example, it seems to me that just the fact that I exist serves to me as, I don't want to say as a proof, but as a connection to that truth. The amount of kindness we receive, right? And yet we're hardwired to believe that we are fixated on the negative things in our life. 9,999 things are going really well, but one thing isn't, and our mind is fixated on it, right? One relationship isn't going well, or something about our job isn't going well. 10 billion things are working in our body, and one thing is not. And we experience our body as broken, as unhealthy, as sick, when in fact it's profoundly healthy. It just has this one thing it has to be addressed, even though it's very serious. Right? So how do we actually reframe our consciousness to see that the enormous, infinite number of miracles and blessings are everywhere? We're immersed in it, the levels of kindness, and that we're profoundly in debt to the world, to those who gave us life, to those who support us, to society, in a sense. And so part of that is spreading the good, but part of it also, and this is part of our theme, is combating the evil we see around us. And that's very difficult for those of us with nuance, those of us who embrace doubt, those of us who have some level of skepticism, those of us who understand that we don't hold absolute truth. It's very difficult to claim that's wrong, that's evil. I'm going to actually combat that because it seems like it's an absolute. And yet, we have to have our lines, right? Where a text asks something that we know is wrong, or where something is happening from our own faith or from a neighbor that we know is wrong. And we have to be willing, I believe, to call that out, even when it's uncomfortable. And of course there's violence and things that can be perceived as evil that emanate from our texts. And one of the questions is, what do we do with that? And I don't think we can claim that any of our faiths or any people from our faiths are absent of this. And I think we have to name it. I think we have a responsibility to name it and call it out. And my belief is to do the work of the outer world, we first have to do the work of our inner world. And that's to say that if we're going to point a finger at someone else, we have to remember that at least 3 fingers are pointed back at us. Right? So if we're going to point at the violence in the world, and we're going to point at the violence in the text, which we need to do, we have to first discover that violence inside of us. Now, whether we can access that through psychoanalysis, or through conversations, or through spiritual writing, or through prayer, to acknowledge that whether it is by nature or nurture, right? Whether it is in our genes to have some violent gene, or whether it's from the frustration of that first year of life where we want all this stuff but can't get it, right? Or whether it emerged from a trauma in our life. There is violence inside of us, right? In fact, some people are surprised at moments in their life when it emerges. They hear themselves scream or they hear themselves respond to something, and they can't believe that was them, right? It may be suppressed, but inside of us there is that angry voice as well. In fact, perhaps that's why there is an angry God of vengeance in the text, because it was once suggested that we are not created in the image of God as much as we create God in our own image. Now, that might sound like a psychological statement that is against religion, but I would suggest that it is from the fact that we are created in the image of God, from that place we create God in our image, which is to say that image we create is some level true because it comes from our own inner godliness, right? Our own sort of violent or angry self also creates a God that has that as well. And so we can embrace that difficulty by destroying the violence of God, by destroying that violence within ourselves, understanding that inevitably some part of the divine is our own projection, and that's okay, because we can't actually leave our minds. We are victims, but also heroes to our own minds and what it projects. It used to be believed that we could access objective truth, but actually no truth doesn't pass through the subjectivity of our minds. So everything we know is subjective, right? Everything we understand, even our understanding of God and of texts. And so one of those stories, which for me is a paradigmatic case of something that crosses a boundary, is in Hebrew called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And I remind us of the story this morning, not only because, so in the Jewish cycle, we read one chapter of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, each week in order to complete it every year, right? So this last week we read the Parsha, the Torah portion called Vayera, which is in the book of Genesis. And this deals with the binding of Isaac. Now, here's a problem I want to put out here, and I'm not going to resolve for us. In the beginning of this portion, of this reading in the book of Genesis, we see Abraham protest against God. What's the case? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The famous case where he's protesting God. If there's 50 innocent people here, will you still destroy the town? If there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 10, will you really kill the innocent along with the wicked? And then he says with a great conscience, can the true judge, act wickedly? He's challenging the divine. He's raising his doubts. The father of all the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths. The fact that there's roughly 2.1 billion Christians in the world. There's roughly 1.4 Muslims, roughly 14 million Jews. Half of the world comes from Abraham, right? Half of the world, it comes from this person who is doubting this God of justice in this moment. So he protests. But what happens only a couple chapters later? God says, I want you to kill your son Isaac. What does Abraham say? Okay, no problem, right? No protest, right? Now, how could the same hero who says, God, how can you destroy the innocent with the wicked, right? Knowing this is a wicked city, how could that same person say, kill my son, no problem, right? It's a problem. I'm not going to resolve it because I think we should live with that tension, right? I think a lot of these texts are about paradox. It's living with the tension that expands our mind and heart and soul rather than just giving us a simple answer. So one of the approaches from the Rabbi, the Gersonides, a thinker in the 13th century Provence. Anyone been to Provence? I happened to live in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months, and I didn't know who Gersonides was at the time, but I wish I did. But here's what Gersonides says. He says, Abraham misunderstood the command. One possible explanation is that God is benevolent. It is impossible for God to act evilly, only good. And so if you understand something as an evil command, you've misunderstood the command, or understood something for God to be evil, it's been misunderstood. And so Gersonides says, Abraham misunderstood the command. It was never to sacrifice your son. In fact, if you look at the original Hebrew, it doesn't say anything about sacrificing his son. It says, bring him up there for there to be a sacrifice. So his approach is, the whole story's been misread. Of course the command wasn't to kill his son. The command is, bring your son up there for a sacrifice. Now, it becomes more difficult because at the end of the story, it says that Abraham passed the test, right? So what test was that exactly, right? And that story can be a story of progress as well because it is the historical transition from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. Who was killed instead of Isaac? The ram. So in the Jewish tradition on Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, we blow the shofar, right, this ram's horn, to recall this story, right, that we transition from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice as a form of progress, right? But here's an explanation I want to offer, is that it is not that Abraham misunderstood the violent command to kill his son. What he misunderstood was the result of Sodom and Gomorrah. He protested God, he raised his doubts, and who won the argument? Well, God did, right? God says, nope, there's still wicked people here, I'm destroying it. Abraham, you're wrong. So Abraham interpreted that as, I shouldn't protest. I should silence my conscience, right? I should just live with blind faith, right? What do I know? I'm just a little person who doesn't understand anything. God says this, silence my conscience, go do it, right? And so what Abraham misunderstood was the result of Sodom and Gomorrah, not the command of the binding of Isaac. That is to say, he misunderstood and said, because God was right there, I shouldn't protest. I shouldn't raise doubts against the text, against my faith. Where actually God was waiting for him to protest in this case also. But what happens is, if you recall the story well, who is it that gives the command to kill Isaac, this violent command? Well, God does. But who revokes the command? He has his knife, right, and there's a lot of beautiful artwork on this image. He has the knife above his son's head, and then a voice emerges from an angel. The text says an angel. So that's very interesting. It is God who commands the killing of his son Isaac, but then it's not God who revokes the command. It's a messenger of God. It's an angel who appears. And part of the message I want to leave us with here, friends, is that we have to not only be willing to hear the word of God, but also be willing to hear the word of the angel when they contradict. One explanation of an angel is not some winged creature flying, right? But is an internal voice. It's the voice of our own conscience. It's the angel from within. And that is to say that I believe that the voice of conscience, the voice of reason, the voice of understanding good and evil that seems to contradict the divine faith or command is also holy and also has to be listened to. And Abraham gets that here, that there's two conflicting commands, and there's a holiness to that conflict. And he understands and ultimately wins by learning to listen to the voice of the angel as well. If you'll pick up the sheet that was passed out, does everyone have one? So part of what I think our answer is that we have to struggle. We have to struggle with these. We can't give simple explanations, and we have to reinterpret, right? That we can't be so simple as to just take literal readings of texts or of events. We have to reinterpret. And so here are two poems, both by Israeli poets who spoke to me, dealing with this story of the binding of Isaac. The first is by someone named Chaim Guri, who's actually still alive to my knowledge today. And this poem is called Inheritance. It's beautiful in the Hebrew, but in case we're not all fluent in Hebrew, I'll read it in the English. The ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question. First of his strength, when his day was on the wane. The old man raised his head, seeing that it was no dream and that the angel stood there. The knife slipped from his hand. The boy, released from his bonds, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what pleasure had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts. How far does violence perpetuate? Right? The scholars suggest, the psychology scholars claim that trauma lasts 7 generations. 7 generations, trauma exists in one's genes, in one's consciousness, that gets passed down through. So if your parent had trauma, if your grandparent, go back 7 generations, it still exists. So an act of violence does not merely scar the individual who's the victim, it scars their ancestors. It scars the bystanders. It scars the society that allows or enables this type of violence to occur. And so I think this raises the bar that, of course, we're not going to perpetuate violence. But how loaded is our obligation to be agents of peace, to be agents of justice, to actually combat that around us, which will not only affect our children, but for generations to come. And the story of binding of Isaac, this poet suggests, leaves a knife in the hearts for generations to come. And in fact, it destroys the God-human relationship too. The binding of Isaac, it is the last time that Abraham ever talks to God. Their relationship is severed. It's the last time that Abraham ever talks to his wife, Sarah. He comes home and she says, "You did what? You did what to our son?" They don't talk again. In fact, Isaac and Abraham don't talk again. Nobody talks to each other. All communication breaks down when an act of violence is even considered, right? Especially when it's done in the name of God. Our second poem here, by Yehuda Amichai. If you haven't heard of him, I suggest you find his poems. They're remarkably deep and worth spending time in. Every year, our father Abraham would take his sons to Mount Moriah. That's the mountain that you find on the news every day now. There's debates about who has access to it, who should pray up there. The Temple Mount, where the temple once stood in the old city of Jerusalem. Every year, our father Abraham would take his sons to Mount Moriah. The way that I take my children to the Negev hills, where I once had a war. Abraham hiked around with his sons. This is where I left the servants behind. That's where I tied the donkey to a tree at the foot of the mountain. And here, right here, Isaac, my son, you asked, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Then up a little further, you asked the second time. When they reached the mountaintop, they rested a bit, ate and drank, and he showed them the thicket where the ram was caught by its horns. After Abraham died, Isaac started taking his sons to the same place. Here I lifted the wood. This is where I got out of breath. Here I asked, and my father answered, God will see to the lamb for the offering. Over there, I already knew it was me. And when Isaac's eyes were dim with age, his children led him to that same spot on Mount Moriah and recounted for him all that had come to pass, all that he might have forgotten. Over there, I already knew it was me. He recounts this story, and to some extent, I want to suggest that we sacrifice our kids today too. It may seem like a stretch, but we sacrifice our kids when we allow them to grow up in a society that is broken, right? We are also heeding that same call of sacrificing them when we allow for a broken educational system, when we allow for gun violence, when we allow for a society that has so many ills. We put our children at risk in this world. We are also sacrificing them in that broken world. And I want to suggest that our compassion should go beyond our immediate circles. It should, of course, be prioritized with self-care and care for our families, care for our neighbors, care for people of our community, but also transcend that. In this beautiful prayer this morning, we talked about those living on $2 all over the world. We talked about Syrian refugees. We talked about, this beautiful prayer, how compassionate we should be to all. And I want to suggest to animals as well, right? It may make us uncomfortable, but the factory farming industry is incredibly violent. And as those who benefit from factory farming industries, drinkers of milk, those who eat animals, right? That we're benefiting from what I suggest is actually the greatest system of violence today, right? Where billions of sentient creatures that experience pain, are being tortured, right? Just down the road from any city in the world, right? This is happening, right? Now, I'm not suggesting everyone needs to become a vegan like I've chosen to. My wife and I chose that on our wedding day, as if we didn't have enough commitments already that day. But we can also make more ethical decisions about our consumption. That today, it's not merely, I saw an act of violence in the street and did I intervene or not. Today, the violence is hidden in many ways. People who are abused in homes and we can't see it. Spouses and children, right? Animals that are tortured behind walls. Those in prison cells who may be guilty or may not be, but are tortured through solitary confinement or the like. Those who are living with mental illness and aren't heard or seen. Right? Our responsibility to see them and to hear them and to protect the vulnerable. And today, and in just a few moments, I want to turn to questions. And here are a few questions in our limited time this morning, so we can have a little bit of a conversation before we wrap up. But today we have a wonderful distraction that makes us feel productive when we're not productive. What is that? The presidential elections, right? We can make 5 million posts about it on Facebook. We can watch every debate. We can read every article. We can have coffee with people who already agree with us and talk about how stupid that candidate is, right? But actually, we've done nothing. We've done nothing. And if we could spend half the time in service that we spend talking about presidential elections, half the time actually with our hands in the mud, or our hands at the soup kitchen that your wonderful congregation's a part of, or at the Andre House, or wherever you get involved. If we spent half the time we spend debating just the politics of society, and don't get me wrong, systemic change is really important, and the democratic process for elections is very important, but how much of that process that we're engaged in is bringing heat, and how much of it is actually bringing light? And I think a lot of the debates today are bringing more heat than they're bringing light. And so if we look at these texts, I think we're being asked to be a force for light over darkness, to embrace that violence is a part of each of our religions. It's a part of our texts. It is a part of being inside of us. And we have to confront those and own them, to claim that none of our religions is perfect. None of our texts are perfect. They have things that make us uncomfortable, and we have to own them and apologize for our histories and apologize for those texts and be a part of an interpretive process that makes clear that we're a people of peace and a people of justice, that take responsibility and don't just engage in apologetics that pretend like those things don't exist, but take responsibility for them. And I think if we just look at the book of Genesis, we see this as a text of taking responsibility. Start at the very beginning. Adam and Eve. What happens? They sin, the first sin in all human history. And what happens? He says, not my fault. Whose fault it is? It's the woman's fault. Geez, did that still happen today? It's all the woman's fault in society, right? Right. So Adam, and then who does she say? Not my fault. It's the snake's fault. He tempted me. So the very beginning of the book is, I'm not responsible, right? As Freud said, I'm not responsible. It's because of my early childhood experiences. As Marx said, I'm not responsible. It's the socioeconomic forces in society. As Spinoza said, I'm not responsible. It's my genes that made me what I am. But actually, we're not our genes. We're not just our early childhood experiences. We're not just a product of socioeconomic forces. We are people with free will that make choices. And so the first story comes to say, yes, I understand you really wanted that fruit. I understand that the snake compelled you and your wife compelled you, but you are responsible. And then Cain and Abel come along, right? And he kills his brother. And he says, am I the guard of my brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And God, the answer, the silent answer is clearly yes. You're not only responsible for yourself, you're responsible for your brother and sister. And then comes Noah. And Noah is called by the Hasidic thinkers tzaddik in peltz, which means a righteous person with a fur coat on. That is to say, there's two ways to keep yourself warm. One way is to put a coat on to keep yourself warm. The other way is to light a candle to keep other people warm. So the whole world is flooding, and he saves himself. But he didn't really persuade anyone. So he's righteous, but he's not a leader. So we come to say, yes, you're not only responsible to keep yourself warm, you're responsible for the broader society as well. And then we get to Abraham, once again, the father of all the Abrahamic faiths. We see here a person who was willing to protest even for the wicked, even for those who have stumbled and fallen and made mistakes. Even there, he feels responsibility. And so I think these texts are coming to raise our consciousness, to challenge us, to inspire us, to be agents of change, to realize that each of us has faults in our own lives. Each of us has hate and anger and violence inside of us. Each of our texts and our histories have that as well. And to truly take responsibility for that, we have to own it and then repair it. And I think channel that energy. Rather than destroy the violence, my belief is we need to channel that energy towards the good. Because we're all craving more energy, more time and energy in our lives to do good. And sometimes the negative energy, rather than being broken, should be channeled. So firstly, there's an old Yiddish story, a Hasidic story, which I'd like to share, which is that, and I'm sure there's different versions of the story in different faiths, that there's a shoemaker named Usha. His name is Usha. And he arrives at the gates of heaven, and the question asked of him, why weren't you as great as Moses? Why weren't you as great as Abraham? Why weren't you as great as your grandmother? Why weren't you as great as this person is? But the question is, why weren't you the true Usha you could be? Right? And that is to say that each of us has our own unique potential. Each of us has our own place we find ourselves, our own relationships, our own corners, where it's our responsibility to bring light. Nobody can bring light to the circles that we're in like us. There's not some model of who we're supposed to be. Each of us is accountable to our own potential, right? And in fact, that potential is a vote of confidence in us. How much opportunity we have to bring light to our families, to our neighbors, to our workplace, right? To whatever place we have power. And so what I want to suggest is there is no one cause to take on or one place to pour this energy, but the two paths that I like to pursue is one, where is my power? And two, where is my passion? Where is my power means I don't just buy pencils and send them to Africa, right? That might be a nice thing to do, right? But actually, I have unique relationships, unique power that I hold in my place in society, and how do I use those power channels to affect change? And the second is passion. We should do things that feed us, that continue to give us light. We are beings that are craving light and craving energy. And so much of the stuff we do drains us of that. We have relationships that are toxic. We have jobs that may be toxic in our lives. We might watch TV shows or listen to music that actually drains us more than feeds us. How do we go to more places and be in more relationships that feed us? And when we serve, how does the service feed us as well? It's not hedonistic. It's not about our own pleasure as much as giving us the energy to go and do it. So I think the service we should do should feed us. And if it's not, we either need to do it differently or change what we're actually offering. To this point of 7 generations, how do we break the cycle? You know, this is something I think a lot about. It's a brilliant question. Because, if you look just something I'm very involved in, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how do you actually stop these kind of conflicts that are so deeply rooted, right? And it's incredibly difficult to change that. And I think an important part of it is friendship. Friendship is broken today. They did a study in the 1980s of men in America, and they found that the average American man, of course, American women tend to be better at friendships than American men, but the average American man in the 80s had an average of 3 friends they could rely on for anything. They did the study again just a few years ago, and they found the average American man had an average of less than 1 friend that they could rely on. 0.8. I don't know what it means to have 0.8 friends. But they had 0.8 friends that they could rely on, right? Friendship has broken, right? The sense of trust, the sense of spending time with each other. As the author wrote, Putnam, right? Bowling alone. That communities have broken. People want to go bowling alone. They want to do things in solitude. They want to be babies again with clenched fists. I'll take care of myself. I'm in control of my happiness. I'm in control of my spirituality. I'm in control of my career, as opposed to holding hands with other people. Joining community requires humility. Right? People say, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual. As if to say, I don't need community. I'll just kind of go in my bedroom and do something on my own. I don't need to be a part of a place, right? Because the humility of a community says 80% of the community works for me, and 20% of what they do I don't like. But that's what it means to be in a community. I don't mind the 20% of what happens there I don't like, because 80% works, and that 20%, it works for someone else. I don't have to complain or quit community, right? So a big part of it, the answers, I think, is about strengthening relationships. It's about strengthening friendships, strengthening our families, strengthening our relationship to strangers, and even to what we perceive as enemies, coming to understand each other. These traumas are healed. In fact, there's a trend, and I'm not necessarily suggesting it, but there's a newer trend that women who have been abused and those who acted violently against them and are in prison, that they go and encounter this person in prison, right? There's a big reconciliation process that's happened in South Africa between the blacks and whites, that's happened between Jews and Nazis, that's happened in so many different cultures of encountering the issue or the person who has scarred us, right? This requires an enormous amount of courage because we want to just block them away. And so I want to pause here to honor our time. Again, I'm going to stay after anyone who's interested in the book or talking a little bit more about some of these issues. And I want to just leave everyone with the blessing. With the blessing that, and I hope you'll give the blessing back to me, that we should live with courage, because it's very hard today to live with courage, to swim against the tide, right? A dead fish goes with the stream, right? Only a living fish is going to swim against the stream. To actually say that society pushes us into spaces of conformity, demanding that we be like everyone else, right? We see things around us and we just live with the injustices and the oppression. We live with the darkness, the sadness, the pain, as opposed to pushing back against it, right? I give the blessing for courage, and I give the blessing for strength that we can continue to find the light inside of us and the light inside of everyone we encounter, and show them their light, remind them of that light as we put our own light into the world. And I give us the blessing that we discover this violence, whether it's visible and obvious around us, or whether it's invisible, that we discover it, we call it out, we combat it, we take a stand, even when it feels like it in some ways puts us at risk. And finally, give us the blessing that we do all of this together, that we continue to have Christian scholars inside Jewish houses of worship, Jews inside of Christian houses of worship, and beyond, other faiths, other encounters where we learn from one another. We make each other uncomfortable with our approaches because we only grow when we're uncomfortable. And yet we also comfort each other in that process of realizing that we're stronger together than when we're separate. And I thank you all for giving me much more than I gave this morning, giving me your light and your attention. And I pray that we continue to redeem and heal the world together. Thank you all so much.